Welcome to DasGeek. First and foremost, this test is just for fun. This is not scientific approach here. As you'll see in some of the results, we are going to compare Linux Mint, Manjaro, and Windows 10 with one another on the beast. And some of the non-scientific approach here is Windows 10 is running on a Samsung Pro SSD while the Linux versions are running on an NVMe M2 drive. So there will be some slight variations there. Otherwise, they're all running on an Intel i7-6700K, 32 gigabytes of DDR4 RAM, and an Nvidia 1080 Founders Edition graphics card. So a very high-end machine. Nothing is overclocked here either. Now, I know some of the Windows people are going to be like, hey, my mom's laptop from 1984 with no integrated graphics gets 1,000 frames per second. I don't know what you're doing wrong in your test. And I look forward to reading your stupid comment. Next, why are we using CSGO? Well, a couple reasons. Number one, CSGO is the number one esports game out there. Probably the number one, but definitely in the top 2 or 3 esports games out there. It is extraordinarily competitive. It is an awesome game and considered the best first-person shooter probably ever made. And additionally, SteamOS has optimized, because of SteamOS, this has been optimized for Linux and for Windows. So unlike some games that are ported sometimes crappily over to Linux or vice versa, this game is a fair representation of both the power of Linux and Windows, I think, fairly. Unlike the pros, though, however, we're going to be running this on 1080p 16:9 ratio with most of the graphics set to high. Those who watch some of the pros know that some run in those on the highest settings, but others like to do the 4:3 ratios with different resolutions that are lower than normal because they get more screen ratio, etc. The screen's more condensed and they don't have to snap as far and those type of things that they feel may give them some competitive advantage. But in this case, we're just going kind of full on with most of these settings to the highest, but all of them set the same across the different operating systems. So we know why we've chosen CSGO here. You're going to see how horrible I am at this game, but I've been playing more and want to get better. So I wanted to know, is there any competitive advantage if you're trying to go pro, which I'm not, but if you're trying to go pro between Linux or Windows 10, meaning should I just play CSGO in Windows 10 and do everything else in Linux? Does it matter? And I think the results will surprise you here, certainly, especially considering NVIDIA's graphic drivers favor Windows, obviously being the biggest desktop environment, although Linux dominates in all other areas. The desktop environment, certainly the graphics vendors are going to focus their attention on Windows there. So, with all that extra attention, I was surprised at the results. I honestly expected Windows to kind of dominate here. Now, all the OSs were updated to their latest state, which took much longer in Windows with the constant reboots. Honestly, it's ridiculous. But finally was able to get there. Punishment for not logging into it for a while, I guess. And we've set the startup options for CSGO to unlimited frame rate. So the FPS scores that I grabbed were based on in-combat situations, so I wasn't capturing moments that you'll see 1,000 or whatever frames per second while we're in a waiting screen or just after you die or just after you start. It was during combat sections that I grabbed the FPS, but you can go do your own calculations if you want. So it's cool to see the 1,000 frames per second on waiting screen, but it doesn't really mean anything. I was running this on 144 hertz monitor, so frankly, all of these OSs you can see got over 300 frames per second, which is just ridiculous, Bill. At that point, so we're pumping in more frames per second than our monitor can refresh them in, and that is awesome and shows the power of this build specifically. Also, the power of Linux and Windows, all the operating systems did fantastically well. So Linux Mint is on the 384.11 driver, so not surprisingly, it was slowest, but when I say slowest, I mean by just nothing. Like, we're still in 300 frames per second here on an average of 336 frames per second is ridiculous. And in some cases, it went 354, 407, 436. It just depends on where you're at in the game. So ridiculous results. So nothing to be ashamed of there. Manjaro averaged 341 seconds. Again, ridiculous results, sometimes coming in at 500 frames per second, 400 frames, etc. and that varied throughout depending on the different areas, enemies on the screen, who was firing, etc. And then, of course, Windows came in, and it was ahead of them, but barely, at 355 frames per second, sometimes coming in, at 284, sometimes 447, sometimes 465 and higher. So just absolutely fantastic results all the way around. I just grabbed random points, as I said. It's amazing when you think about the fact that you're on a console and you're trying to get to 60 frames per second. And here on this computer, we're talking about over 300 frames per second on all of these. So this isn't a 100% scientific test. Again, I just grabbed 23 random samples as the game was going on, fighting, and calculated those together. Now, you may have a different approach or had a different experience because you have different hardware, but this is mine, and I think it's fantastic and shows me there is absolutely no reason that you cannot be a pro Linux CSGO player today running on Linux Mint or Manjaro for that fact. You could also obviously do very well in Windows. They all ran fantastically, which is amazing considering the Windows 10 has the latest Nvidia drivers and obviously a little more support from Nvidia. But with that said, Linux gaming is a beast and continues to get better and better as we go along, and this just proves how awesome gaming on Linux is today. Leave your comments below. Let me hear about your mom's laptop and the integrated GPU that gets 10,000 frames per second. I can't wait to hear about it. And until next time, get out there and fill your brains.
Don't forget to subscribe.